In the United States, I firmly believe we haven't gotten to the point where privacy or individual privacy is some type of right that we have, versus in Europe and GDPR, it is.
Welcome to Privacy in Practice, the podcast where we bring you the latest insights, practical solutions, and real-world stories from the world of data protection and privacy. I'm Kelly Dupree.
And I'm Donnie Strachen. Privacy in Practice is brought to you by VeriSafe, your trusted partner in privacy and data protection. In this podcast, we dig into the challenges and opportunities in privacy compliance, from navigating complex regulations to building a sustainable privacy program that works for your business, not against it.
So let's jump in and get practical with privacy.
Today, we're thrilled to welcome Jim Schneider to the podcast, a highly experienced leader in compliance and data privacy with over 15 years of expertise in the life sciences industry. Jim currently serves as Senior Director, Counsel of Compliance and Data Privacy at Immunome, a clinical stage oncology company.
Throughout his career, Jim has played key roles in building compliance programs within organizations like Seagen and American Medical Systems. His deep understanding of both the legal and operational aspects of data privacy and compliance in the biopharma industry provide invaluable insights into the unique privacy challenges faced by clinical trial and life sciences companies.
Today, Jim will share his practical advice with us on navigating the complexities of privacy in clinical trials.
Welcome, Jim. Thank you for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks. And thank you for the intro. I appreciate it.
Tell us, if you don't mind, a little bit about your background and maybe in particular how you got into privacy.
And I think before I start, I'll just do the standard intro, which is that comments made during this time are my own and not necessarily represent the opinions of existing or past employers. But I got into privacy back in 2010 or 2012, somewhere in that time frame. Working for Boston Scientific in Minnesota. I was actually working in compliance and was kind of helping out the data privacy officer there as they were reviewing business associate agreements. And then later over time, as I moved out to the West Coast for Seattle Genetics, about the same time, GDPR was starting to ramp up and companies were starting to get ready for that. So Seattle Genetics was also starting to get ready for that. So I led a team of individuals as we built out the first privacy program and, stood things up and got ready for GDPR. Over time, I think I migrated back into compliance there, but I stayed on as on the executive privacy committee that we had stood up to help make decisions and policies based on privacy in that company.
So in your day-to-day life, you get very much involved in what is called a clinical trial. So some listeners might have an idea what that is. If you don't mind, for those that don't know what a clinical trial is, what does it involve and what makes it special?
Clinical trials, I think, especially in the privacy context, I think just narrowing it down to clinical trials in the human space, when we get to human testing for potential new treatments, a sponsor like a medical device company or a biotech company or a pharmaceutical company on their own or either through like a third-party representative called a clinical research organization, find sites that are willing, sites being, could be an academic institution or a hospital or a clinic, site that has doctors and staff and capability to conduct the research that they're looking to do. Usually these are broken up into 3 different phases, kind of depending on, the type of trial you're doing. But the first one is trying to determine whether or not the treatment itself, whatever you're testing, is safe. The second one is trying to determine whether it's effective. Is it doing, what it's supposed to do? Is it killing the cancer cells in particular, if you're an oncology company? And then also a little bit working out the dosing. So trying to understand what's a safe and effective dose. And the third one is typically the treatment now with the dose figured out against placebo. So that's kind of what a clinical trial is, high level. In the privacy sense, privacy plays a pretty substantial role, especially in obtaining consents and using the data itself, transferring the data around.
As and for anyone else listening, that's something we do a lot of at VeriSafe, is helping clinical trial, usually sponsors more than CROs, in running their trials in all the different stages. I loved the phase explanation. That's helpful, I think, to think of it in that way. I think the privacy challenges are both very unique, and also, if you're a privacy professional, they'll be familiar. They're particular to their context, but they're the same principles. So you mentioned consent. I think that's a tricky one, because there's consent that's the good clinical practices concept of consent. You need informed consent from a participant to participate in your trial. And then in the GDPR, you have this concept of explicit consent.
When you're talking about GXP or GCP consent, which has been around longer than GDPR and the privacy concerns, really, that's focused a lot on the moral and ethical considerations, really trying to help the study participant understand what it is they're getting into. Like, what are you signing up for? That's why ICFs are written in plain English. And it is really about trying to ensure that the participant knows what they're consenting to. GDPR side or other privacy law sides in relation to consent in an ICF, or more about what are we doing with the data, ignoring for a second whether or not the participant knows what they're getting into. It's more about helping them understand what it is that is going to be done with their data that is derived from the trial. Are we going to use it in the future? Who's going to be able to see it? Making sure they understand that while it is, pseudonymized or key coded, that, regulators might be able to, actually see the data.
You've mentioned an important point now, because I think that's one of the things that makes a clinical trial quite unique from a privacy perspective. In many organizations, when you're processing personal data, you're often processing personal data of individual consumers, website users, customers buying things online, and you know who they are, and you have their email address and their physical address if you have to deliver stuff. Sometimes you even have financial information or credit card details. But in a clinical trial, it's very different. Typically, the sponsor doesn't actually have the details of the participants, shouldn't have them. How is that handled, and what is this key coding concept?
Yeah, so the sponsor themselves doesn't have the ability to actually find out who the individual is, right? So it's pseudonymized or key coded. So I'm not sure if it's at the site level or when the research is being entered into the database, but at some point, an individual their name is removed from whatever information is flowing on to be, researched and figured out if we have an appropriate activity going on in the trial or if things are working. They're assigned like a number or some other type of variable. And unless you have the original document that has the key in it, you don't know as the sponsor who these individuals are. But the trial still needs to be able to make sure that individual really exists, for example, or if there are safety concerns, be able to de-identify that person.
There's this tension between, in a couple different instances, where you need to maintain the science, the validity of the science. That's that good clinical practices, or in the EU, it's that clinical trial regulation. There's rules and laws all over the world about how to run a clinical trial ethically, safely, but also authentically and with integrity. As a privacy professional in the clinical trial space, sometimes what seems like a good principle from a privacy perspective needs to be weighed against what is a requirement of running an effective clinical trial. And maybe one of those is a data subject rights request. In the GDPR and in a bunch of different privacy laws, data subjects have this right to be forgotten or right to deletion. And, that doesn't really work in a clinical trial where you need to maintain the integrity of the results, and you need to know what happened with the people who consented to be part of your trial. So how do you handle deletion requests?
Yeah, and that's an interesting point. I think in the early days of GDPR, in the United States in particular, that was a major concern. I know, at least at the company I was at the time, the clinical teams were very concerned about that. Can't just delete data out of your data set. That impacts a number of things from good clinical practices and making sure that your trial design is doing what it's supposed to do. So you can't really be pulling data out of your data set when you get a data subject access request for these type of things. I think you can handle it in the ICF. You can inform the person that while we can pull their records out of, certain areas, their information, even if they withdraw from the trial, whatever information we've already collected and is part of the data set is going to remain in the data set. And I think that's probably the best way. I haven't actually had any clinical trial participant request to be deleted from the trial data itself. And I don't know if any of the listeners have had that, but I'd be interested to understand how they process that. But similar to any type of data subject access request, you have to get back to them within a certain amount of time. And even outside of the clinical trial space, there are times when it's not possible or cannot be done. And so I think you would just have to be upfront with whoever's requesting it, reminding them of the ICF to the extent that's in the ICF, and just letting them know that the data can't be removed from the clinical trial data itself, but perhaps you could take it out of other areas and let them know what those areas are.
But fortunately, the data subject still has his or her or their rights. So even though they cannot contact the sponsor, and even though they might not be able to delete it, typically they would be able to get in touch with the institution that's running the trial, so they can speak to their study doctor and ask them, well, what data is being processed on me, or can I object to this, or can I delete it, or basic things like update my contact details. So it's not like they don't have their rights.
Right. And you do bring up a good point, which is another thing that you probably should do is direct them back to the site, right? Because you don't know who they are as the sponsor regardless, right? You don't know that they are part of your trial or not part of their trial. And so that's a good point. The sponsor themselves should be just kicking it back to the site to the extent they even know who the site is, but probably just telling the individual to go back to whatever site it is that they were at.
It also causes other challenges, I think, this whole clinical trial blind that we're talking about, and sort of maintaining the key coding and this pseudonymization that happens sometimes, that data ends up, or not necessarily in the wrong hands, but you have a situation where someone gets access to data that shouldn't get access to that data. So it's not always a situation where you have a hacker breaking in, and you could end up in a data breach because someone who isn't authorized to access the data has now managed to get hold of it because, let's say, they got more access than they should have had on their user account, or they got copied on an email and someone shouldn't have copied on that email. But there's also the good clinical practice issue, because on the one hand, you now know who the data subject is, but you also have a data breach. So in your role, it creates almost more work than in a typical sort of privacy officer role, because you have to look after these sort of strict privacy compliance, but you also have to look at all these other ethical issues under GCP and GXP.
Yeah, there's definitely that aspect. And I think I would add that there's also the aspect of HIPAA in there, right? If you, the sponsor, are getting that information, that's not information that you should have as part of the clinical trial. So that's another, I think, area where you have an inadvertent disclosure of some kind. But yeah, there are definitely concerns with what you mentioned. Certainly, depending on how they got it, that could be something that you need to take some remedial action on at a broader level to understand how they got it. And I think really the answer is trying to understand what happened and remediate that so it does not happen again. And documenting certainly what happened in case there are questions down the road.
Jim, we've mentioned an interesting topic, which is HIPAA. And it's something that we often hear in the context of a clinical trial. It's something that you rightly or wrongly see in clinical trial related documentations, these references to HIPAA. Some people seem to think it's a privacy law. Some people think that it's somehow related to clinical trials. Can you help us demystify that?
So it is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, I believe is its full name. I think it's from like the mid-90s, 95, 6, 7, somewhere in there. And I think originally when it first came out, it was more about efficiency, but in the context of it really is also talking about that there is definitely data that is sensitive. They recognize that as they were crafting it. And so there are protections in there. It's I would say certainly not a comprehensive data privacy protection style rule. It's not a GDPR style rule. Um, but it is, from a privacy perspective, it is protecting, protected health information or patient health information. And I think that is probably why people maybe incorrectly associate it directly with clinical trials. It certainly does have its place in the clinical trial. The sites, so the places that are actually running the trial, have a duty. They're a covered entity under HIPAA. They have a duty to the trial subject to protect that information. And in addition to just protecting it, they need to get an authorization from that individual, typically to be able to use this data, to share this data. And that does get into the ICF. So the ICF, oftentimes a site will add their clinical authorization or HIPAA authorization into the ICF documentation that then goes to the actual person to sign, and the actual subject to sign. So it certainly has its place in clinical trials, a lot on the site side. And certainly if there are labs involved or other entities that might work for the site itself, then it's involved there as well. But it is not necessarily covering the sponsor side. The sponsor, at least in the context of a clinical trial, isn't covered entity by HIPAA. Caveat that in the medical device space, that could be a little different. Some devices are collecting data on their own accord. Devices have warranties, things like that. So medical device manufacturer is a little different. But in the context of the pharmaceutical space and in the more narrow context of a clinical trial, not usually a covered entity.
I think this is one of the most misunderstood things, perhaps by more lay people than people who work in clinical trials more generally. But I think it's a very common misconception that if it's health information, particularly research health information, surely HIPAA must cover it. And the way HIPAA is written, it doesn't start with the information. There's many ways you can write a law, right? And the GDPR starts in some ways with the data subject, right? Because it's a human rights law. But HIPAA is written in a somewhat unique way in the sense that it starts with, what kind of an entity are you? Are you a covered entity? Are you a business associate, or are you nothing? And if you enter it that way, it's a little bit unusual. And I think that it's weird to a GDPR lawyer that data that was protected health information, when in one entity's space, once it leaves, it no longer is that, or it no longer is covered by HIPAA. I think that's a weird thing to wrap your head around coming from the GDPR space.
Yeah, that's good commentary. And I think also, it's an interesting, it's just a different way of approaching privacy altogether. As we said, I don't think this was necessarily designed as a privacy law right out of the gate. But in the United States, I don't think that we have gotten to the point, I firmly believe we haven't gotten to the point where privacy or individual privacy is some type of right that we have, versus in Europe and GDPR it is. And so I think if you are a GDPR specific lawyer, I agree, it would be very interesting to be looking at all the different various health or data privacy style laws in the United States, because they're not written that way. To your point, they're either written specifically for a very narrow type of data in a very narrow instance, or they're written like this, which is, again, I think was more designed to help get data from place to place to better the health system. And then, oh yeah, we better protect that information as well.
You're sitting in-house in a compliance role, in a legal role. Somebody comes to you and says, "Oh, we signed that business associate agreement. Aren't you proud of us?" What do you say?
I say, no, not proud of you. No, and what's interesting is at every place I've been, rather than try and have the business determine whether they should be signing a business associate agreement, I just tell them, if you see BAA or business associate agreement, or they come under different names, but if you see an agreement that's someone asking you or telling you that you are bound by HIPAA in some way, those come to me, or to the legal department, or to whoever is managing. If you're doing a lot of those, if you're getting a lot of those, maybe there's a person doing it. but those are not something that you should sign lightly. And I think those are often misunderstood. There are some contexts where you have to. Your group health plan, you're going to need to sign a BAA to be able to get, data to the right places. But yeah, I would not be proud of them. I would be concerned, and I would want to know exactly the context in which we signed it.
It feels to me like we should perhaps, just for people who aren't familiar with HIPAA, maybe just explain what a covered entity is and what is a business associate. I think what some people say, if they have to compare it to GDPR or something, they often say the covered entity is like the controller, but that's not really correct. But it's the hospital or other institution that's doing the treatment often, whereas the business associate is similar to a processor or a service provider, maybe in the CCPA kind of context. Let's maybe just explain the differences to people who don't understand that, and maybe also when this business associate agreement might have to be signed. So in other words, when are you a business associate?
Yeah, a business associate, which we call a BA or a BAA, is a business associate agreement. That is usually used when a covered entity is having a vendor or the BA themselves works for a covered entity and needs access to PHI or to do whatever it is that they're doing. One starting place is really to look at the relationship in the agreement. If someone comes to me and says we signed a BAA, in my context, in the pharmaceutical space, it's pretty rare that we're working for somebody. Generally, somebody is working for us. So like if a clinical site, which doesn't happen as much anymore, but if a clinical site in the context of a clinical trial asked us to become a BAA, that would be really kind of bizarre, because the clinical sites we are actually not working for them. They are actually working for us in the context of a clinical trial. But yeah, a covered entity, sometimes one way to think of it is that it is whoever's doing the treating, or sometimes whoever is collecting the information in the first instance, and it's health related information related to the treatment. That is another way to look at it. But a business associate is someone who needs access to that information and is working for a covered entity.
It's important to figure out when HIPAA applies or doesn't apply, though, especially now with all the US state privacy laws and other privacy related laws in the US. Often there's an exemption for processing that's governed by HIPAA. So either way, you have to figure out, is this something that falls within the scope of HIPAA? Because it might help you to be exempted from one law, but then you have to comply with HIPAA. And I think we've also encountered this where you have data breaches. Sometimes a specific state's data breach law might not apply if HIPAA applies, but then you have to look at HIPAA's breach rules and vice versa. So the landscape is complex, and I think there are just so many balls that you have to keep in the air mentally and juggling them when you have to try and make these determinations.
It's impossible to keep them all in the air at one time. Like you really have to approach whatever situation it is that has happened, and almost you don't have to start from zero every time, but understanding the state privacy rule right out of the gate, and how it's different than HIPAA and so on, and whether or not, if a breach happened, or a suspected breach or a potential breach happened, or an incident happened, which rule are you in? That does play a role for sure, and you do have to just go through each law that could apply and determine which one could be more than one, but which one applies.
And it's a very intricate exercise that could have serious consequences, because you might get out of one state's breach laws, but you might end up in a federal situation where you're dealing with a much sort of stricter regulator that has sort of much wider authorities and scope. So it just shows you how complicated the privacy landscape is and is becoming. And you really have to keep up to date with everything, and knowing the basics, I think, is just so crucial now.
And I think that's why, like, a lot of privacy professionals were hoping that there would someday be a US federal version of GDPR, right? Because every year it seems like we get more and more state rules, and those are, like you said, you can't remember them all. That is a lot. But yeah, and I think to add to your point earlier about what you said, that you could get into, more of a sticky situation, is if you start talking about an actual breach where you have determined that this was a breach of some kind, oftentimes you're going to have to report that in your corporate filings, et cetera. You might have to get your insurance involved, and that becomes a much bigger issue. And I think I would say that um, really starts to come into play when you start talking about HIPAA style issues versus, maybe you have an issue at the, you know, Florida state privacy breach law or something along those lines.
That analysis of whether or not you're a covered entity is on its face fairly straightforward, and then in the weeds can actually be kind of messy because it's such a sort of a strictly defined thing. You mentioned, the medical device world as one example where you can possibly wade into HIPAA territory, even as a sponsor of a trial, if what the trial is about is some kind of medical device. Can you speak to that a little bit more?
If you think about some of the technology that's out there right now, it is collecting data on its own. If you're thinking about, I'm just going to make this up, but like a pacemaker or some type of device that's inside of you, and the sponsor or the producer of that technology has the individual's name, right? Those devices are under a warranty, so they have all the information. It's not like a clinical trial where they may not have all that information, but in those type of trials, it is important for safety purposes to be able to go back and, especially if it's something that that can be enabled remotely, or via the internet. But yeah, but there are opportunities, a lot more opportunities for signing business associate agreements in the device space than pharmaceutical space, because pharmaceutical products don't really, on their face, need the data to work. They don't actually need to know who you are, whereas devices might. They might need to know your height, weight. It might be calibrated based on all kinds of things. So there's a lot more information that those systems might need in order to work.
It's a complicated area for sure.
Yeah, and I think I'm just thinking about your life as a privacy professionals at a biopharma or biotech or life sciences company. It's one thing to understand the privacy laws and all these privacy laws that are coming out and their requirements, but you're also operating in a very complicated space with complicated terminology, and it's assumed that you understand a lot about the life sciences aspects. How important is non-privacy knowledge in your kind of role? What kind of background knowledge do you need sort of to help you fulfill your function as a privacy professional?
That's a good question, and I think it depends a little bit on who you are as well. Certainly, if you have a background in chemistry or some type of medical background, that is going to be something that helps you out. But I don't have a background in that, and you will pick stuff up over time just through osmosis. Where I'm sitting today, I actually sit amongst all scientists mostly, and so you do pick up on a number of things, and it is helpful to understand terminology. But I think what's more helpful is understanding the process of how something goes from a thought all the way to how it becomes an actual product for sale in whatever jurisdiction you're in. That is more important, I think, than actual understanding of the science. Because if you understand how that process is going, then you also understand where the privacy concerns are. Any privacy professional will be able to issue spot once they understand what is actually involved in a clinical trial, for example. But I also think you have to keep an open mind to help think and know and understand that not all these privacy laws, many of them are not tailored for clinical trial activities. And so you have to be willing to work and really try and understand the process and understand the end goal of a clinical trial, and not put things in place that are going to keep that goal from reality, but are still keeping you within the confines of whatever rule it is you're working with.
I think that's an excellent point, and one of the ways in which that comes to mind for me is future use. So that's a topic that a lot of pharmacists, so just for anyone listening that isn't as familiar. So future use is the idea that at the end of a clinical trial, you may have data, information that is useful for additional research, sometimes by you or sometimes by somebody else. So it's really valuable information because it's vetted, it's been through the rigor of a scientific analysis. And if you are testing, for example, a cancer drug, and you were testing it, as you noted, initially for safety in a phase 1 trial, and now you have all this well-vetted data, and there's something you can do with leftover blood samples to now test that vetted data, say, for efficacy, you may wanna do that. Or maybe you learn something, your IP changes slightly, there's a new way you can look at a different biomarker or immunoresponse or something, and you might wanna do that. So all of that is considered future use, and the consent associated with that in the EU is a little bit complex at the moment. So knowing that that's a big part of your business use case, that's the kind of thing that you would, yeah, as you say, as you know the whole end product, then that really benefits you in your role. Have you had to deal with future use things? Any advice for people trying to navigate that?
Yeah, and I think one thing to point out is I do actually think that some even different countries within the scope of GDPR have different rules on whether or not you can even have future use in your original ICF. And when I say that, I mean it's very common in the industry in the ICF to outline all the items you need to know for your standard clinical trial language, the GCP consent, that even the GDPR consent, et cetera, and then have a separate consent within that document that talks about future use. Explains to the individual, you may keep your samples. Sometimes we call it biobanking, things like that. Some countries, it can't actually be in that same document, and it needs to be in its own separate document or its own separate consent. So understanding that is also, I think, important. And I will say, even in the United States, there are now rules that I think are going to be impacting future use of data. So, but yeah, it is something that comes up, and it's an important consideration, because if you lose the ability to do that, that takes a pretty important part away from the actual purpose of running a clinical trial, which is there may be future questions we can answer without having to start up a whole new trial with whatever we've collected. So it may not be a full blown product that you can create out of that, but you can get answers from that data. So
running clinical trials is often an exercise that goes across borders. You don't only have sites in one country. Often you're dealing with a situation where the clinical trial sponsor is situated in the US, but sites are in the EU or elsewhere. And it is becoming increasingly more complex. So I wanted to chat a little bit about these cross-border transfers, specifically whether the rules regarding US bulk data transfers are applicable. When would they be applicable? When would they feature in a clinical trial? Any thoughts about that?
This is a relatively new law, right? So this became law in April of this year. And we're calling it the bulk data transfer rule. I don't recall its official name, but and it does prohibit or restrict different types of transactions of data, and it defines data in a couple different ways. I think there are 5 categories of data, but it's all something that's derived from a U.S. citizen, and the term bulk is different for each one of the categories. But yeah, this definitely will impact particularly the future use, I think, category. I will say there are exceptions to this rule, which is interesting, because many of these privacy rules and I wouldn't actually call this a privacy rule so much as a transaction or a cross-border type rule, because it's not the comprehensive data privacy law we were hoping for from the United States. It's more of a cross-border or transactional style law. But they definitely do have 3 exceptions, I think, that are important for the industry. So that may play a role in the future as we design clinical trials where there are cross-border activities. Even if you have a clinical trial, which is, let's just say, all US, completely US, but the CRO you're using has, entities or sub-entities in any one of those countries that the bulk data transfer rule is trying to prohibit transfers to. A transfer, just like many of the other privacy rules, doesn't necessarily mean you sent that biospecimen or type of data to it, but that they have access. And so I think there's a lot to unpack with this rule, and I think it is going to play a role in clinical trials.
China is, of course, maybe in the clinical trial space, one of the more relevant countries. It's a lot of science that gets done in China.
But these rules, I mean, including the bulk data transfer rules, I think just emphasizes again how important it is to know who your vendors are in a clinical trial and where they're located, because they could be located in China. They could have data centers there. I'm just generally not just in a clinical trial. I mean, there are lots of vendors that are used in business operations across the board where data processing might be happening in China. And we've recently seen this with TikTok getting a significant fine. And the whole issue about people not using the tools that are made available to them to go and check up on their vendors, check where they're located, get data processing agreements in place, do security reviews. All the basics, I think, aren't being attended to sometimes. But I think now with the TikTok fine and also with the bulk data transfer rules, the fact that there's possible criminal liability involved, I think it's a good time for people to do that housekeeping, update that data map, see where the vendors are, where are they located, are you transferring data to a country where there are problematic surveillance laws? What are you doing to mitigate against potential risks? Do you have measures in place? Are you doing transfer impact assessments? It's the life of a privacy professional has become very, very complicated.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think when I read through some of the bulk data transfer rule information that's out there, it's 6 countries now, but it seems like it could be more countries in the future. So just going back into how you mitigate something like the bulk data transfer rule, it really, I think, starts with your vendor intake. However, whatever process you're utilizing on the vendor intake side before you start contracting, there's usually a question where they're trying to determine if this is a vendor that GXP is applicable to. A lot of people out there are probably familiar with putting their GDPR questions at the front of that process as well, which is a good practice. But this is another place where you might put something for the bulk data transfer rule, understanding what it is that is going to be sent to that vendor, if anything, whether it's related to a human in the United States. And does that vendor have some type of affiliation with one of those 6 countries, or being located in one of those 6 countries is a good way to start the conversation. But I think you need to approach something like this at a couple places. That's early on, and you hopefully will be able to get a conversation with whoever's requesting that that vendor be stood up at your organization and try and understand. But another place is right at the contract request. And if all else fails, I think one thing that I would think is a good practice is putting it in your MSA, that your reps and warrants that, this vendor's not going to be receiving this data, or that this entity's not going to be transferring this data to any of the covered entities. You can even say as applicable on top so that you don't get pushback from every single vendor. But it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. If you do put that in there and if vendors start pushing back, you might learn a lot about their structure as an organization that you didn't know before.
Any final advice, Jim, for someone interested in your job, interested in getting into this kind of a career space?
Yeah, if you're looking to be someone who is in the data privacy space at biotech, pharma, med device, I would say be prepared to work and be ready to adapt. Because you're going to need to be able to do both. We've talked a little bit how some of these privacy rules aren't specifically tailored to our industry, with the exception of the bulk data transfer rule, which does have some. But yeah, you're going to have to be willing to try and understand exactly what it is your business is trying to get or obtain, and then work within the confines of whatever rule it is you're talking about. So you're going to have to be prepared to work and be ready to adapt, because I think we all know that these rules are becoming more prevalent, especially in the United States. And it may change, one day could change what you're doing from the next day. So be prepared to adapt and be ready to work.
I think that's generally quite good advice.
Thanks so much, Jim. It's been a really insightful discussion today, really interesting. It's almost amazing to hear how the space in which other privacy professionals has to operate in, and while there are common privacy principles, how the applications are sometimes so different and complex. I think lots of respect to you for doing the job that you're doing. Thanks so much for joining us today. It's been great.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
That's it for today's episode of Privacy in Practice, brought to you by VeraSafe.
If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes. And we'd love to hear from you. Send us an email to podcast@verasafe.com.
And to learn more about VeraSafe's data protection and privacy services, you can visit us at verasafe.com.